The door in front of him was made of black iron, and it had no handle. Jaewon stood before it anyway, one hand pressed flat against the cold metal. Blood dried along his knuckles in 3 different shades. Behind him, the floor was littered with the corpses of things that used to be dragons. Somewhere far below, a friend's body was still cooling. He had climbed for 40 years to reach this door, and now that he was here, he wasn't sure he wanted to open it. A soft chime rang out from nowhere and everywhere at once. The tower's voice, calm as a lullaby, told him the 100th floor was clear. It asked if he wanted his reward. He almost laughed. 40 years, and the system still talked to him like a customer. To understand why a grown man stood shaking in front of a door that wasn't supposed to exist, it helps to go back. Back to a morning that started with nothing more dramatic than a torn bag of chips. Jaewon had been 31 years old, standing in the fluorescent glow of a convenience store, annoyed that the bag had split down the seam and scattered crumbs across the counter. That was the whole crisis in his life that morning. He remembered apologizing to the cashier, an old habit from his years in uniform, apologizing for things that weren't really his fault. Then the emergency alert hit every phone in the store at once, and the ground began to shake. People assumed it was an earthquake first. Earthquakes made sense. What happened next did not. A shape tore up out of the pavement 3 blocks away, black stone stacking on black stone, climbing into the sky faster than any building had a right to. Windows shattered from the pressure alone. Car alarms went off in a wave, one street at a time, like dominoes falling in the wrong direction. By the time Jaewon made it outside, there wasn't a street left to stand on. There was a hole where 4 buildings used to be, and rising out of that hole was a tower with no visible top, its surface crawling with faint red symbols that pulsed like something breathing. He wasn't the only one staring. All over the city, all over the world, identical towers were punching through concrete and soil, and every person within a certain radius felt the same tug behind their eyes, like a hook sinking into the back of their skull. A window appeared in front of him, translucent and impossible, informing him that he had been selected as a walker, and that the tower required a challenger. Most people screamed, some ran, a few dropped to their knees and prayed to whatever they still believed in. Jaewon just read the message twice, because rereading things calmly was another old habit, one that had kept a squad of younger soldiers alive back when he still wore a rank. He noticed the fine print at the bottom of the window. It offered something called a return stone, a way out, a promise that using it would send him back to the exact second before the tower rose, memory intact, danger gone. Thousands of people used it in the first hour alone. He watched a woman beside him vanish mid-sentence, her mouth still open around a question she never finished. He didn't take the stone. Later, he would tell himself it was because something about the offer felt wrong. Too clean, too generous for a thing that had just swallowed 4 city blocks. The truth was messier. Guilt doesn't like easy exits. A man who watched a subordinate take his own life over an order Jaewon gave doesn't reach for an escape hatch just because one is offered. So he stayed. He climbed. The tower called itself a nightmare tower, and inside it, time didn't behave the way it should. A single day outside could stretch into weeks within its walls. Nobody explained why. The system never explained anything it didn't have to. On the first few floors, Jaewon learned the rules the hard way. Adaptation, the tower called it. Fight monsters, gain stats, unlock skills, level up like a character in a game none of them had agreed to play. Most walkers adapted quickly, sprouting fireballs and blade auras and healing circles within the first month. Jaewon's stat window stayed almost embarrassingly plain. No elemental affinity, no hidden bloodline, just a body that could swing a sword, and a thrust he'd learned in basic training decades ago, back when his biggest worry was passing a physical fitness test. While others discovered flashy powers, he practiced the thrust. Over and over in the sense that he never stopped, though he made sure never to think of it that way, since thinking in circles was its own kind of trap. He drilled it in every spare hour between floors, refining the angle of his wrist, the timing of his breath, the exact moment his back foot needed to leave the ground. Other walkers laughed at him for it, in the early days. A soldier waving a stick around like it was still boot camp, while people beside him summoned lightning. He kept swinging anyway. It was on the 7th floor that he met Ronald. Ronald was loud in a way that shouldn't have worked in a place built to kill people, but somehow did. He had been an amateur chef before the towers rose, and he treated every floor's monster loot like ingredients for a meal he was determined to cook eventually, Tower rules be damned. He was the first person to make Jaewon laugh in that place, cracking some joke about a dead Frosthair having surprisingly lean cuts while 3 other walkers stared at him in horror. Jaewon didn't want to get close to anyone. He'd learned that lesson already, back on Earth, in a different uniform. But Ronald had a way of attaching himself to people whether they wanted it or not, and somewhere around the 15th floor, Jaewon stopped trying to shake him off. They built a small group together, a shield user named Priya who never spoke above a whisper, but never broke formation either. A pair of siblings who fought like they shared one nervous system. For a while, floor after floor, it almost felt survivable, almost felt like they might all make it out the other side and go home to lives that were waiting for them, frozen in place outside. The tower didn't allow almost. By the 40th floor, the siblings were gone, taken by a trap none of them saw until it was too late. By the 60th, Priya sacrificed herself holding a barrier so the rest of the group could clear a hallway of collapsing spikes. Each death cut a little deeper into what was left of the group's nerve. Each death left Jaewon a little quieter, a little more certain that the tower fed on more than monsters. Ronald stayed. Through all of it, somehow, Ronald stayed. He stopped joking around the 80th floor. The humor drained out of him slowly, the way color leaves a photograph left too long in the sun. He still smiled, but it took visible effort by then, a muscle he had to consciously flex instead of something that happened on its own. The Doctor of Despair, an old awakened man they encountered briefly on floor 88, warned them both about something he called the weight of the climb. He said most people who made it this far weren't broken by monsters. They were broken by how much of themselves they'd had to leave behind on the lower floors just to survive to the higher ones. Jaewon didn't fully understand what he meant. Not yet. They reached floor 99 with 9 walkers, down from the original 19 they'd banded with over 4 decades of climbing. 9 became 6 by the time they cleared the outer chamber. 6 became 2 by the time the actual Guardian revealed itself. A construct built from the fused corpses of previous failed attempts, wearing dozens of faces that still twitched with expressions that weren't quite alive and weren't quite dead. Jaewon and Ronald stood back to back against it, the way they'd stood back to back against 100 smaller horrors before this one. This time, the numbers didn't work out. The construct's arm swept low, aimed at Jaewon's blind side. Ronald was faster getting there than he had any right to be, plunging his own blade into a gap in the joint to redirect the strike. It worked. The strike missed Jaewon. It didn't miss Ronald. He went down hard, one hand pressed against a wound that no healing item in either of their inventories was going to close. Jaewon killed the construct in the next 4 seconds, driven by something that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with rage, his thrust punching clean through its central mass and out the other side. By the time he turned around, Ronald's breathing had already gone shallow. There wasn't much time for last words. Ronald managed one crooked attempt at his old smile, though it barely rose past his teeth this time, and told Jaewon he was glad he hadn't taken the stone on day 1, because 40 years with a grump who couldn't cook was still better than 40 years alone. Then he asked, quietly, if Jaewon would go find good food when it was all over, and eat something that wasn't tower rations, just once, for both of them. Jaewon promised he would. Ronald didn't answer after that. Jaewon sat there for a long time, before he could make himself stand up. The tower didn't pause for grief. It never had. A notification blinked patiently in the corner of his vision, informing him the floor was cleared, waiting for him to acknowledge it like nothing had happened at all. He climbed the last set of stairs alone. Which brings us back to that door. Black iron, no handle, 40 years of climbing standing behind him along with every person he'd lost along the way. He pressed his palm to it, and the door simply dissolved, grain by grain, like sand caught in a wind he couldn't feel. The room beyond wasn't what he expected. No throne, no monster, no final boss waiting to test him. Just a wide, quiet chamber that looked disturbingly like an office, with glowing screens along the walls and a single figure lounging in a chair that had no business being that comfortable in a place like this. The figure introduced himself as Beast Lane. He didn't look like a demon, not the way old stories described them. He looked bored, mostly, the way a manager looks bored reviewing a shift he's watched 1,000 times before. He clapped, slow and unimpressed, and told Jaewon that in 40 years, nobody else had made it this far without cashing in a return stone somewhere along the way. Jaewon asked what a return stone actually did. Beast Lane smiled, and that smile was the first genuinely inhuman thing about him. He said it might be easier to just show him, and with a lazy wave of one hand, one of the glowing screens along the wall flickered to life. It showed Earth, not a ruined Earth, not the smoking crater Jaewon had watched swallow 4 city blocks 40 subjective years ago. It showed a perfectly ordinary city, traffic moving, people walking dogs, sunlight falling on unbroken windows. The convenience store where he'd been annoyed about a torn chip bag was still standing, its lights still on, a new employee behind the counter he didn't recognize. Jaewon stared at the screen for a long moment before he found his voice enough to ask what he was looking at. Beast Lane told him, almost gently, that he was looking at home. That home had never actually been destroyed, that the towers on Earth's surface had been an illusion layered over reality itself, designed to convince a very specific number of humans that everything they loved was already gone, so they'd have nothing left to lose and nothing left to run back to. The return stones weren't time machines. They were dream demon stones, gateways into a private illusion tailored to whatever the user wanted most. An endless, comfortable dream where the tower never rose and nobody they loved ever died. Every person who'd taken a stone on day one wasn't safe at home. They were trapped in a fantasy, their real bodies slowly being harvested for something Beast Lane called cultivation, their souls siphoned off floor by floor to fuel a market Jaewon wasn't even supposed to know existed. And the people who climbed instead, the ones like Jaewon, the ones who fought and bled and buried friends floor after floor? Beast Lane explained that with a shrug, like it barely mattered. Their struggle had never been a war for survival. It had been premium content, a rare, high-yield strain of suffering, refined through genuine risk and genuine loss, worth exponentially more on the market than the passive dreaming of a stone user. He told Jaewon, almost like a compliment, that his 40 years of grief and blood had made him one of the most valuable products the tower had ever produced. Jaewon didn't say anything for several seconds. Somewhere behind his ribs, something that had been holding steady for 40 years quietly gave way. Ronald hadn't died protecting a future worth reaching. He'd died feeding a farm. Beast Lane, apparently mistaking silence for shock rather than the calm before something much worse, moved on with his pitch. He offered Jaewon a reward for reaching the 100th floor, a full memory wipe and a fresh restart. Back on the 10th floor, stats retained, trauma erased, ready to keep generating value with a smile on his face. He framed it as generous. He framed it as the good ending. He asked, almost cheerfully, whether Jaewon wanted to accept. The temperature in the room dropped, though nothing in the room had physically changed. Beast Lane's smile faltered for the first time. Some old instinct, in whatever passed for his gut, recognizing danger a half-second too late. Jaewon lifted his sword. It was the same sword he'd carried from floor 1. The same simple thrust he'd drilled a billion times while people mocked him for wasting his time. He told Beast Lane, in a voice that didn't sound entirely like his own anymore, that he'd take the reward. Then he asked if the demon wanted to guess what it was. Beast Lane didn't get the chance to guess. The thrust that came for him wasn't fast in any way the eye could track, because speed wasn't really the point anymore. Something in Jaewon had stopped bending under 40 years of grief and simply broken clean through it instead, the way a dam doesn't crack slowly so much as vanish all at once. A window flickered open in front of his eyes, uninvited, informing him in cold system text that he had achieved something called doubt, the first stage of a power the tower had no category for. His stats, still humiliatingly blank across every normal category, suddenly meant nothing at all. The blade met Beast Lane's chest, and the demon didn't fall so much as unravel, his shape coming apart into strands of red light that dimmed and thinned and finally guttered out like a candle starved of air. His office, his screens, his comfortable chair, all of it followed him into nothing within seconds. There was no dramatic final scream. There was barely time for one. Jaewon stood alone in a room that no longer existed, holding a sword that felt heavier now than it ever had, though nothing about its weight had changed. He looked up. Above him, where a ceiling should have been, there was only a pale, featureless barrier stretching endlessly in every direction, the underside of whatever reality sat on top of the tower's little pocket world. He thought of Ronald's crooked smile, offered with half his strength in his last seconds, and something in him decided that a barrier built by liars didn't deserve to stay standing. He drove the same tired thrust upward. The strike didn't just pierce the barrier, it tore a wound in it, wide and ragged, edges curling back like burned paper. Cold air rushed through the gap, carrying smells that didn't belong to any tower floor, ash and old blood and something sweetly rotten underneath. and Jaewon climbed through his own hole in the sky into a world nobody on Earth had ever seen. He fell for longer than felt reasonable before he hit solid ground, rolling once and coming up with his sword already raised. 40 years of instinct, refusing to let him land carelessly, even in a place he knew nothing about. The land around him was gray, not the gray of fog or smoke, but the gray of something with all the color drained deliberately out of it. Hills and stunted trees and a sky with no visible sun, only a diffuse light that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Later he would learn this place had a name: Chaos. The afterlife itself, the resting place of every human soul that had ever died, now apparently just another farm with better scenery. He didn't get long to take in the view. A scream cut through the gray stillness, sharp and close, and old habits sent him running toward it, before he'd consciously decided to move at all. He found a small group cornered against a rock face by a pack of horned beasts, gray-hided things with too many joints in their legs and antlers that dripped something dark and steaming. 3 fighters stood between the beasts, and a 4th person on the ground, clearly wounded, clearly out of options. One of the 3, a woman with red hair matted with dirt and dried blood, held a curved blade in a stance that was more stubbornness than actual technique at this point, her arms shaking from exhaustion rather than fear. She was the one who noticed him first, a stranger dropping out of a hole that shouldn't exist, and she didn't waste breath asking who he was. She just told the others to hold the line a few more seconds. Jaewon didn't bother with introductions either. He crossed the distance in a way that made the horned beast's head swing toward him a full second too late, and his thrust opened up the lead beast from throat to haunch in one motion, momentum carrying him straight into the second, before the first had even finished falling. The rest of the pack scattered within moments, some instinct in their animal brains recognizing a threat that outclassed them by more than they could process. The red-haired woman lowered her blade slowly, watching him with the particular wariness of someone who had survived this long by trusting almost nobody. She introduced herself as Mino Han, once a shadow warrior under one of the sect banners, currently leading whatever was left of her unit after their patrol got ambushed. She didn't thank him outright. She asked, flatly, what a walking corpse smell like his was doing dropping in from the sky. Since new arrivals to Chaos usually came in through the proper channels, not through holes torn in the world. Jaewon told her the truth, since he didn't see much point in anything else after everything he'd just learned. He'd come up through a tower, he'd killed the demon running it. He didn't know where he was going next, only that he wasn't interested in following any more rules written by people who profited off his obedience. Mino studied him for a long moment, something calculating behind her eyes that had nothing to do with distrust and everything to do with old habit. She'd clearly spent a long time in a place where every stranger was an angle to be worked, every kindness a debt waiting to be called in. She decided, out loud, that he was either the strongest fool she'd ever met or exactly what her group desperately needed. She didn't specify which she believed more. The wounded fighter on the ground turned out to be a boy barely past his teens, a scrape from those beasts already darkening ugly along his ribs. Jaewon had nothing in the way of healing items, not the kind this world apparently used, but he tore a strip from his own sleeve and pressed it against the wound anyway, the same rough field aid he'd have done for any soldier under his command decades ago on a planet that no longer felt entirely real to him. Mino watched him do it without a word, and something in her posture eased by a degree that had nothing to do with the fight being over. She told him, once the boy was stable enough to lean on one of her other fighters, that the nearest safe ground belonged to Gorgon Castle, one of the 4 castles ruling this stretch of chaos. It wasn't friendly territory exactly, but it wasn't hostile either, provided a person knew how to behave at the checkpoint. Jaewon asked what behaving at the checkpoint involved. Mino's mouth twitched, close to something like a smile, the first one he'd see from her. She said it mostly meant not doing what he'd just done to those beasts in front of the guards, since Gorgon's checkpoint enforcers took a very personal pride in being unchallenged. He decided, privately, that he'd take that as a suggestion rather than a rule. The walk to Gorgon Castle took the better part of a day by Mino's count, through gray hills and past the husks of structures that had clearly belonged to someone once, long enough ago that even the ruins had started to fade at the edges. Jaewon used the time to ask questions, and Mino, loosening slightly the longer they walked, answered most of them. Souls in chaos didn't hunger the way the living did, she explained, and they didn't age or feel drunk no matter how much of the local liquor a person poured into them. But something in them still rotted, slowly, an invisible corruption that built up over time unless a person fed on horned beast crystals or certain kinds of spectral essence. Left unchecked, that corruption turned a soul into a ghoul, mindless and violent, a fate apparently common enough that nobody flinched anymore when it happened to someone they'd known. She said this last part with the particular flatness of someone who'd watched it happen to people she cared about. Jaewon noticed, without saying so, that the boy they'd saved kept glancing at him sideways with something close to worship, and that Mino noticed him noticing, and neither of them commented on it. The gates of Gorgon Castle rose out of the gray hills like something built by hands that had stopped caring about proportion. Towers stacked unevenly atop a wall thick enough to house rooms inside its own stone. 2 guards stood at the checkpoint in armor etched with glowing sigils, and Mino's posture straightened noticeably as they approached, old discipline reasserting itself out of habit. One of the guards demanded travel authorization before either of them could speak, his voice carrying an edge of bored menace that suggested he enjoyed this part of his job more than he should. Mino began explaining their situation, the ambush, the wounded, the stranger who'd helped, and the guard cut her off partway through with a raised hand, more interested in Jaewon than her explanation. He said something about unregistered new arrivals needing to be bound and processed before entry, a formality, nothing personal, and a chain of pale silver light unfurled from his gauntlet before Jaewon had time to object. The chain wrapped around Jaewon's wrist, and the guard smiled the small, satisfied smile of a man invoking a law older and more absolute than anything a mere soul could resist. He called it the Silver Prison, a binding enforced by the castle's own founding decree, unbreakable by anyone below a certain rank. Jaewon looked down at the chain for a moment, then he flexed his wrist, almost lazily, the way a person might crack their knuckles before picking up something heavy. The chain didn't strain or spark or resist, it simply snapped, both ends drooping uselessly toward the ground, the silver light guttering out of it like a snuffed candle. The guard's expression didn't so much fall as collapse entirely, the confident menace of a moment ago replaced by the specific horror of a man realizing the rules he'd built his whole authority around meant nothing here. Mino, beside him, made a small sound that might have been a laugh she swallowed at the last second. The second guard reached for something at his belt, some alarm or weapon, but Jaewon was already past him, walking through the gate like a man who'd simply grown tired of waiting for permission that was never coming. Nobody stopped him. Nobody, at that particular moment, had the nerve to try. Inside the castle walls, Gorgon proved to be less a fortress and more an entire city folded into stone, streets full of soldiers and merchants, and soul-marked citizens, going about routines that had probably repeated themselves for centuries without much variation. Word of the checkpoint incident seemed to travel faster than Jaewon could walk, hushed conversations breaking off as he passed, eyes following him with a mixture of fear and open curiosity. Mino guided him toward the castle's inner district, explaining that if he wanted proper gear for whatever fight was coming next, he needed to see the master blacksmith, an old grump who forged weapons for the castellan's own personal guard and answered to almost nobody. The blacksmith's forge sat at the end of a narrow street, heat rolling off it in visible waves even from a distance, the ring of hammer on metal audible half a block away. The old man inside didn't look up when they entered, absorbed in the piece under his hands, and when Mino tried to explain what they needed, he cut her off with a grunt that made clear he didn't take commissions from strangers who hadn't earned the privilege. Jaewon set his sword down on the workbench without a word. The blacksmith glanced at it, unimpressed at first, the plain, worn blade nothing special to a man who'd forged legendary weapons for decades. Then his eyes caught on the faint discoloration along the fuller, the specific pattern of wear that only came from one exact motion, repeated an impossible number of times, and something in his expression shifted from dismissal to a kind of wary recognition. He asked, quietly, how many times a person had to swing a blade the same way before it started remembering the shape of the strike on its own. Jaewon told him he'd stopped counting somewhere past the first 100 million. The old man was silent for a long moment, turning the sword over once in his weathered hands before setting it back down with something that looked almost like respect, an emotion Mino later admitted she'd never once seen him extend to anyone in the years she'd known him. He said he had an elite beast horn sitting unused in his stores, harvested from something powerful enough that nobody else had dared commission a sheath from it, afraid of what a weapon paired with that material might demand of its wielder. He asked if Jaewon understood what he was asking for. Jaewon said he understood well enough. He wasn't looking for a weapon that demanded anything from him. He'd already given this world everything he had to give, back on a tower floor with a friend's blood cooling against the stone. Whatever came next, he intended to be the one making the demands. The blacksmith's mouth curved, just slightly, something between amusement and approval, and he told him to come back at dawn. That night, sheltering in a room above a tavern Mino knew, Jaewon learned there was trouble brewing deeper in the castle. Whispers about the Golden Sky Sect, one of Gorgon's 10 ruling factions, moving against the Castellan himself in some scheme involving forbidden corruption rituals. Mino's information was thin, second-hand, the kind of rumor that traveled through back channels and grew stranger with every retelling. She admitted, staring into a cup of something she wasn't really drinking, that she didn't fully understand yet what he intended to do with the strength he clearly had. She said most people who could break a silver prison chain with a flex of the wrist used that kind of power to take a castle for themselves. Jaewon told her he wasn't interested in taking anything. He was interested in making sure nobody else got fed to a system the way his friends had been. Something in Mino's face went very still when he said that. An old cynicism she'd worn for longer than she probably wanted to admit, cracking just slightly at the edges. By dawn, the sword had a sheath carved from horn dark as old iron, and Jaewon had a destination. Somewhere in Gorgon Castle, the Golden Sky Sect was about to learn that the castle's own Castellan wasn't the only thing worth being afraid of. The rumors about the Golden Sky Sect turned out to be smaller than the truth by a wide margin. Mino led him toward the castle's inner sanctum through a service corridor she claimed only a handful of people still remembered existed, a shortcut carved generations ago by servants who'd wanted to avoid crossing paths with certain nobles. The stone here was older, darker, veined with a faint reddish tint that Jaewon didn't like the look of even before Mino explained what it meant. She said corruption left stains like that when it built up in a place for long enough. The deeper red the vein, the closer something rotten sat beneath the surface. They emerged near the Castellan's private chambers just as 3 cloaked figures slipped out of a side passage, moving with the practiced quiet of people who'd done this exact walk many times before. Mino's hand shot out, catching Jaewon's sleeve before he could step into view, and she mouthed one word: Golden Sky. They followed at a distance instead of confronting, and what they found waiting in the shadow of the old audience hall was worse than either of them expected. A dozen more cloaked figures stood in a loose circle around a sigil burned into the floor, its lines glowing the same sickly red as the veins in the corridor stone. At the center of the circle, bound and gagged, knelt an old man in robes far too fine for the treatment he was receiving. His eyes, when they briefly opened, held the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been fighting something invisible for far longer than his body could sustain. Mino's breath caught. She whispered that the old man was the Castellan himself, ruler of Gorgon for over 3 centuries, a figure she'd only ever seen from a respectful distance during formal ceremonies. One of the cloaked figures, clearly the one running the ritual, stepped forward and pressed a hand against the old man's chest. He announced, to nobody in particular, that after 2 years of patient work, the sigil was finally ready to take root, that the corruption they'd been quietly feeding into the Castellan's soul had reached a density no purification rite could reverse. He said this with the satisfaction of a man who'd been waiting a long time to say it out loud. He explained, mostly for the benefit of his own followers, that once the Castellan fully ghoulified, the sect would step forward as the only faction capable of subduing the beast their ruler had become, earning both credit and control of Gorgon in a single stroke. It was, he said, the cleanest coup Chaos had seen in a century. Jaewon had heard enough plans built on other people's suffering for one lifetime. He stepped out of the shadows before Mino could stop him, and the leader's confident smile only had time to flicker once in confusion before Jaewon's blade opened a line across his chest that ended the smile permanently. The other conspirators scattered into motion, some drawing weapons, others reaching for the sigil to accelerate whatever they'd been building toward, panic making them sloppy in ways their careful planning hadn't accounted for. Jaewon didn't give them room to recover their composure. He moved through the circle the way water moves through a crack, finding the gaps between their formations before they'd finished forming one, his thrust ending each fight in a single motion, rather than a drawn-out exchange. Within a dozen heartbeats, only one conspirator remained standing, backed against the wall, hands raised in a gesture that was less surrender and more desperate stalling. This one, older than the rest, with sect insignia marking him as some kind of elder, started talking fast. He said the Castellan was already too far gone, regardless of what Jaewon did to them. that the corruption had passed the point of return months ago, that killing the sex operatives now would only leave Gorgon defenseless when their ruler finally broke. He was, unfortunately, telling the truth about at least one part of that. The sigil beneath the bound castellan flared bright, and the old man's back arched with a sound that wasn't quite human, bones audibly shifting beneath robes that split at the seams as something larger tried to force its way out of a body never built to hold it. Mino grabbed Jaewon's arm, pulling him back a step as the transformation accelerated, skin darkening to a mottled gray-black, eyes bulging and multiplying across a face that no longer resembled the tired old ruler from a moment ago. The elder conspirator, seeing his own plan finally reaching completion, actually laughed, a high, unstable sound, and declared that once the Mega Ghoul finished manifesting, nothing in Gorgon would stand against it, and the sect would simply wait out the chaos before stepping in as heroes. Jaewon's expression didn't change. He told him that plans built on watching other people suffer had a way of ending badly for the person holding the leash, and drove his sword through the elder's chest mid-laugh, cutting the sound off along with the rest of him. That left only the thing rising in the center of the room. The Mega Ghoul stood nearly 3 times the castellan's original height by the time it finished forming, limbs bending at angles no living creatures should, a dozen mismatched eyes rolling independently across a face still faintly recognizable as human beneath the corruption. Its voice, when it came, layered 2 tones on top of each other, one weak and pleading, buried underneath something ancient and gleeful that called itself Soul King Catastrophe, and claimed dominion over every scrap of rot in chaos. Mino's face went pale at the name. She said quietly, "That name belonged to a myth, a sealed god nobody had actually seen manifest in centuries, and if it was speaking through the castellan now, the situation was worse than any of them had understood walking in." Jaewon didn't have much use for myths. He'd already watched one demon unravel into nothing after underestimating him, and he saw no reason this one should be different. The Mega Ghoul's first strike came fast for something its size, a clawed hand sweeping wide enough to have taken out the entire hall if it connected. Jaewon didn't try to block it. He stepped inside the arc instead, closer than the thing expected anyone sane to get, and drove his thrust upward into the center of its chest where the sigil's glow burned brightest. The impact staggered it back a full step, cracks of red light spiderwebbing across its torso like a dropped plate about to shatter. The weaker of its 2 voices, the one still faintly recognizable as the old castellan, cried out in something that sounded almost like relief buried under agony, as if some small part of him still trapped inside was grateful for the pain. The Soul King's voice, layered beneath it, snarled that a soul as insignificant as his had no business wounding something eternal. Jaewon told it, flatly, that eternal things broke just fine as long as someone hit them hard enough, and drove the thrust in again. The second strike didn't just crack the creature's chest. It went straight through, the sigil at its core shattering like glass under a hammer, and the Mega Ghoul's mass began collapsing in on itself, gray-black flesh sloughing away in chunks that dissolved before they hit the floor. The layered voice screamed both its tones at once, fury and relief tangled together in a sound that echoed off the hall's high ceiling. What remained when the collapse finished was the old man again, shrunken and unconscious but breathing, the corruption purged from his body along with whatever fragment of the ancient god had briefly ridden inside him. Mino let out a breath she'd clearly been holding since the transformation started. She said, half to herself, that she'd expected to spend the rest of her existence in Gorgon, avoiding ever meeting the castellan's gaze directly, and instead she'd just watched a stranger she'd known for 2 days casually banish a myth back into whatever hole it crawled out of. The old man's eyes fluttered open within the hour, weak but lucid, and when he understood what had happened, what had almost happened, he did something neither Jaewon nor Mino expected. He asked Jaewon's name, listened carefully to the answer, and then declared, in front of the handful of loyal guards who'd finally arrived far too late to help, that a man capable of purging a sealed god's influence and breaking a sex coup, single-handedly, deserved to rule Gorgon, far more than an old ruler who'd nearly gotten himself possessed through sheer negligence. Jaewon tried to refuse. He said he had no interest in castles or titles, that he'd come to Chaos to tear down a system, not inherit a piece of it. The old man, still trembling from exhaustion, told him that refusing wouldn't change the outcome, only the paperwork. Gorgon needed a castellan strong enough that the next conspiracy wouldn't get this far, and every guard in the room had just watched exactly who that needed to be. Mino, arms crossed, told him with a faint, tired smile that arguing with an entire castle's collective decision was a battle even he probably wasn't built to win. He accepted the title, eventually, mostly because he recognized a losing position when he saw one, though he made it clear to everyone within earshot that Gorgon under his name would be a staging ground, not a throne room. He had bigger targets than a single castle's internal politics. Word of what happened in the audience hall spread through Gorgon within a day, and from Gorgon, it spread outward through chaos faster than any of them anticipated. Within a week, the leaders of the other 9 sects that made up Gorgon's ruling structure had requested, or more accurately been informed, that an audience with the new Castellan was mandatory. They arrived expecting negotiation. What they got was a demonstration. Jaewon met each sect leader individually, in a courtyard cleared for exactly this purpose, and rather than discuss terms, he simply asked whether they intended to challenge his authority the way the Golden Sky sect had tried. Most hesitated. A handful, proud enough or foolish enough to think their decades of rank meant something in the face of what he'd already proven, attacked. None of them lasted longer than it had taken the Mega Ghoul to fall. He didn't kill them, not the ones who fought fairly, only the ones who tried the same corrupted tricks the Golden Sky Elder had favored. The rest he left humiliated but breathing, disarmed in front of their own followers, made to understand exactly how far below him they stood. By the time the 10th sect leader picked herself up off the courtyard stones, brushing dust from robes that had definitely seen better days, all 9 surviving factions had reached the same unspoken conclusion. Fighting individually got them nothing but bruises. United at least, they might survive whatever came next. Jaewon gave them a choice that wasn't really a choice. He told them chaos needed an expedition, eventually, towards something bigger than sect politics and territorial squabbles. He told them the tower system on Earth wasn't the only lie built on human suffering, and whatever sat above chaos, whatever the abyss actually was, needed people strong enough to reach it and tear its own lies open, the same way he'd torn open beast lanes. He told them, plainly, that none of them were strong enough yet. Not even close. The sect leaders, humiliated and still nursing wounded pride, didn't take that well at first. One of them, a broad-shouldered man who led something called the South Seas Contingent, pushed back hardest, insisting his people had trained for centuries and didn't need a stranger's assessment of their worth. His name was Cayman, and he had, by his own admission days later, spent most of his centuries in chaos, being told by everyone above him that talent was something he simply lacked. He'd clawed his way to sect leadership through sheer stubbornness rather than any natural gift, and hearing a new arrival casually dismiss all that effort in a single sentence lit something furious in him. Jaewon didn't apologize for the assessment. He offered something else instead. He said if Cayman thought his centuries of effort deserved better results than they'd gotten, he could prove it, in a tower, on Jaewon's terms, under conditions that would either break him completely or finally show him what he was actually capable of. Cayman accepted before he'd fully thought through what he was agreeing to. The Doctor of Despair, the same ancient awakened healer whose warning had gone half understood back on the tower's 88th floor, turned up in Gorgon not long after, drawn by rumors of an unadapted human tearing through sect leaders and sealed gods alike. He was smaller than Jaewon remembered, or maybe just more tired, 1,000 years of survival etched into every line on his face, and he didn't bother with pleasantries when he finally cornered Jaewon in the castle's makeshift war room. He said he'd warned him once, a lifetime ago, that this kind of power carried a cost, that a mind wasn't built to hold this much rejection of its own reality without cracking somewhere along the way. Jaewon told him he remembered the warning. The doctor's expression didn't soften. He said remembering a warning and heeding it were 2 very different skills, and he intended to stick around long enough to make sure Jaewon learned the difference before it killed him. Nobody argued with that. Mino, standing near the doorway with her arms crossed, muttered that at this rate their little group was assembling faster than any of them had planned for, and asked, half serious, whether the new Castellan intended to charge headfirst into whatever waited above chaos with barely a handful of allies and a training regimen built on spite. Jaewon told her that spite had gotten him further than most people's grand strategies so far. She didn't have a good argument against that either. Within the month, he'd gathered the sect leaders, Cayman loudest among them, into a single expedition squad, dragging all 10 of them, some willingly, most not, into a nightmare tower he'd claimed for exactly this purpose. Time inside would move the same punishing way it always had, weeks compressed into days, days into hours, and he intended to use every second of that compression to force awakening out of people who'd spent centuries assuming the system's ceiling was the only ceiling that existed. Kamen asked, the night before they entered, whether Jaewon actually believed any of them could reach what he'd reached. Jaewon told him belief wasn't really the point. He said he hadn't believed it either, back on the 99th floor, holding a dying friend who'd never once complained about how unfair the climb had been. Belief was a thing that showed up after the work, not before it. Kamen didn't have anything to say to that. He just nodded, once, and followed him through the gate the next morning. Behind them, Gorgon settled into an uneasy peace. 10 sects bruised but unified for the first time in longer than most of their leaders could remember, waiting to see whether the man who'd broken all their pride in a single courtyard could actually deliver on the promise he'd made about something bigger than any of them had dared imagine. Ahead of them, inside a tower built to bend time itself, the real training hadn't even begun. The tower Jaewon chose for their training wasn't gentle about the time it borrowed. 10 sect leaders walked through the gate, expecting some accelerated but familiar version of what they already knew. Monsters to grind, stats to climb, the same currency of power they'd spent centuries accumulating. What they got instead was Jaewon standing in the first chamber, arms crossed, informing them that none of their skills would work here. He'd sealed them, every sect technique, every inherited bloodline ability, every convenient system shortcut they'd leaned on for longer than some of them had been alive, locked behind a barrier woven into the tower's own walls. What remained was whatever raw strength, raw instinct, and raw stubbornness each of them actually possessed underneath all that borrowed power. Kamen took the news better than most, mostly because he'd never had much borrowed power to lose in the first place. The others reacted the way people usually react to having their crutches kicked out from under them mid-stride, indignant first, then afraid, then, slowly, furious in a way that had nowhere left to aim but inward. The first monster wave hit within the hour. It wasn't anything exotic, just beasts scaled to punish overconfidence, fast enough to punish hesitation, and strong enough to punish sloppy footwork, the kind of threat that any of them could have handled easily with their sealed techniques intact. Without them, 3 sect leaders went down hard in the opening minutes, saved only by Jaewon stepping in with a thrust that cleared the immediate danger before it turned lethal. He didn't offer comfort afterward. He told them, plainly, that this was the gap between what they actually were and what their systems had been quietly covering for. One of the sect leaders, a proud woman who led something called the Ashen Veil Contingent, demanded to know what the point of all this humiliation was, if he intended to just keep bailing them out every time they failed. Jaewon told her the bailouts would stop the moment she stopped needing them, and not a moment before. She didn't have a response for that. None of them did, not for the first week, which unfolded across roughly a month of compressed tower time. They fought without their crutches, fell without their crutches, and slowly, grudgingly, started building something underneath that wasn't borrowed from anyone. Kamen adapted fastest, which surprised exactly nobody who'd spent any time around him. Centuries of being told he lacked talent had left him with something the others didn't have: total comfort with failing badly and trying again anyway. He'd fall to the beasts 12 times in a single afternoon and get up a 13th without any of the wounded pride that slowed the others down. By the second week, most of the group could hold their own without their sealed abilities. By the third, a few had started showing flickers of something new, small cracks in the wall between adaptation and whatever lay past it, the same doubt Jaewon had felt in the moment Beast Lane unraveled in front of him. The Doctor of Despair watched all of this from the sidelines, occasionally offering commentary nobody had asked for. He told Jaewon, one evening while the others slept off another brutal day, that forcing awakening through raw suffering worked, technically, but it was a blunt tool. He said he'd seen it attempted before, 900 years ago, on an expedition he'd been part of. Most of the people he'd started that climb with hadn't survived it. Jaewon asked what happened to the ones who did survive. The doctor's face did something complicated, old grief folding into itself the way it does when a person has had a very long time to get used to carrying it. He said survival wasn't always the better outcome, and left it at that. Jaewon didn't push. He recognized the shape of a wound a person wasn't ready to open, mostly because he was carrying a few of his own. Kamen broke through in the 4th week, in the middle of a fight he had no business winning against a beast 3 times his mass. Something in him simply stopped treating the fight as a contest of strength and started treating it as a question of whose will gave out first. His strikes, sloppy just days before, suddenly landed with a precision that had nothing to do with technique and everything to do with pure, unfiltered refusal to lose. A window flickered open in front of his eyes, the same cold system text Jaewon had seen on the 100th floor. Doubt achieved. He stood there afterward, staring at his own hands like they belonged to someone else, and admitted, quietly, that for the first time in longer than he could remember, he didn't feel like the weakest person in whatever room he happened to be standing in. Jaewon told him that feeling would come and go, but the strength underneath it wouldn't. That was the part that mattered. 2 more sect leaders broke through before training ended, though neither with the clean intensity Kamen had shown. The rest made progress without fully crossing the threshold, closer to awakening than they'd ever be through conventional means. But not there yet. Jaewon decided that was enough for now. Perfection wasn't the goal. Survival long enough to be useful was. They emerged from the tower changed, all 10 of them, carrying themselves differently than the bruised, arrogant leaders who'd walked in weeks of compressed time ago. Gorgon Castle, when they returned, seemed to sense the shift immediately, guards straightening at their passage in a way they hadn't before, whispers following the group through the streets with something closer to awe than fear. It was in the weeks following their return that Serwin Armelt found him. She didn't announce herself the way most people did, with formal introductions or wary distance. She simply appeared one evening in his private quarters, having bypassed every guard and ward Gorgon possessed without apparent effort. A succubus with sharp violet eyes and an expression that suggested she found the entire castle mildly beneath her notice. She told him, without preamble, that she'd heard about the human who'd torn through a sealed god like wet paper, and she'd come to see for herself whether the rumors matched reality or whether Gorgon's people had simply lost their nerve over an overhyped stranger. Jaewon asked what she intended to do if the rumors turned out to be true. She smiled, and it wasn't a friendly smile. She said she crafted towers for a living, real ones, the kind that shaped a person from the inside out, and a human strong enough to break one of the old system's rigged games unassisted was exactly the kind of raw material worth harvesting for something far more interesting than Beast Lane's crude little farm. She called him, almost fondly, a product with excellent potential. Something about that phrase landed wrong in a way that had nothing to do with insult and everything to do with memory, Beast Lane's voice echoing under hers. Product, product, the same word dressed up in a different mouth. She didn't wait for his answer. She moved fast, faster than anything he'd faced since the 99th floor's guardian, and the room around them dissolved before he could fully react, walls and furniture peeling away like old paint, replaced by something that felt less like a place and more like the inside of a nightmare specifically built for him. He recognized it almost immediately as her craft, the 8 Gates of Hell, a mental construct she'd woven from fragments pulled straight out of his own memory, each gate representing a piece of his past she intended to use against him. The first 3 gates passed in flashes, minor traumas, old failures, moments of doubt he'd buried under decades of forward motion. He fought through them without much difficulty, some old military discipline recognizing the shape of a mental attack even when the terrain didn't make physical sense. The 7th gate stopped him cold. He found himself standing in a barracks that no longer existed anywhere but his own memory, facing a row of soldiers he recognized instantly, all of them illusions conjured from Serwin's construct, all of them wearing the face of a subordinate who'd taken his own life over an order Jaewon had given years before the towers ever rose. The illusion looked at him with an expression that mirrored the real man's last one exactly, and Serwin's voice, distant and clinical, informed him that this gate demanded he cut down every echo of his own guilt before it would open. Jaewon's hand shook around his sword for the first time since he'd started climbing. He'd spent 40 years burying this specific wound under floor after floor of monster corpses and dead friends, never once actually looking at it directly. Now it stood in front of him in a dozen identical copies, waiting. He asked the illusion, quietly, why it had done it. He'd asked the real man's ghost that question in his own head 1,000 times over the years and never gotten an answer that helped. The illusion, built from nothing but Jaewon's own memory and guilt, didn't have an answer either. It simply looked at him the way the real man had looked at him in his final moment, tired and forgiving in a way that had always hurt worse than anger would have. Jaewon understood, standing there, that he couldn't cut down guilt by attacking its shape. He'd tried that for 40 years, funneling grief into thrust after thrust, and it had never actually made the weight lighter. It had just given him somewhere to put his hands while he carried it. He lowered his sword instead. He told the illusion, and by extension told himself, that he forgave the choice, even if he'd never fully understand it, and that he intended to keep living anyway, not despite the guilt, but alongside it, because stopping wasn't something either of them would have wanted from him. The seventh gate didn't shatter the way the others had. It simply faded, gently, like something finally allowed to rest. The eighth gate opened on its own. Beyond it, he found not a memory, but something stranger. A small boy sitting alone in a version of the barracks that looked untouched by time. Younger than any version of himself he actually remembered being. The boy looked up at him with an expression too old for his face and told him, plainly, that he'd been the one holding the door shut this whole time, keeping the monsters of Jaewon's own mind contained so the rest of him could keep climbing. Jaewon asked if the boy wanted to come with him now, wherever he was headed next. The boy shook his head. He said someone had to stay and keep watching the door, at least a little longer, and asked only one thing in return: whether the person out there, the one wearing his older face, actually had friends now. Jaewon thought of Ronald's crooked smile. He thought of Mino's reluctant, dry humor. He thought of Kamen standing there staring at his own hands like he'd finally met himself for the first time. He told the boy yes, he had friends. The boy smiled, small and real, and the eighth gate closed gently around him, sealing whatever remained of that particular wound somewhere safer than it had ever been before. The construct shattered entirely. Jaewon came back to himself in his own quarters, the walls and furniture exactly as they'd been before Serwin arrived, and found her staring at him with an expression that had lost every trace of the mocking confidence she'd walked in with. Her arms were crossed tight against herself, and something in her violet eyes looked almost unsettled. She told him, voice quieter than before, that nobody had ever survived all 8 gates with their sense of self intact. Most people broke somewhere around the 5th, become exactly the kind of malleable product she'd been hoping to harvest. Jaewon asked why she'd used the boy's memory specifically, out of everything she could have pulled from his mind. Serwin's composure cracked further, an unfamiliar flush rising along her cheeks. She admitted, reluctantly, that the construct always drew on whatever was most deeply buried, and she hadn't chosen that memory, so much as discovered it there waiting. She said something about the boy's face reminding her of someone else entirely, an old friend she hadn't thought about directly and longer than she cared to admit, and refused to elaborate further no matter how he pressed. He noticed, standing there, a faint resemblance he hadn't clocked before, something in the shape of her jaw, the particular violet of her eyes, that echoed a name he'd heard mentioned only in passing since arriving in Chaos. He asked if she was related to someone called Molark Armelt. Serwin went very still. She asked carefully how he knew that name, since Molark had vanished from every record and every memory she'd bothered to check centuries ago, written off by most of Chaos as a myth or a corpse, whichever people found more comfortable to believe. Jaewon admitted he'd only heard the name in passing, secondhand rumors from sect leaders discussing the tower system's original architecture. He didn't know anything more than that. Something in Serwin's expression shifted again, less hostile now, more genuinely uncertain, the look of a person confronting a thread she'd deliberately avoided pulling for a very long time. She told him, quietly, that Molark had been her godfather, the one who'd built the first towers, the one who'd disappeared chasing some truth about the abyss that nobody else believed existed. She said, almost to herself, that maybe it was worth believing again. A window flickered open in front of Jaewon's own eyes at that exact moment, unrelated to the conversation, but timed with an irony that felt almost deliberate. It informed him that surviving the 8 gates intact, choosing forgiveness over destruction at the 7th and honesty over denial at the 8th, had pushed him past doubt and understanding entirely into something the system labeled Genesis, the stage where a person's rejection of the world's rules became strong enough to build something of their own in its place. He felt it settle into him differently than the earlier stages had, less like breaking something and more like finally having room to build. Serwin watched the flicker of recognition cross his face and asked, cautiously, what had just happened. He told her he wasn't entirely sure yet. He suspected he was about to find out the hard way. She didn't offer to harvest him anymore. Instead, unprompted, she offered something else. Her help, and her knowledge of towers and gates. If he was serious about following whatever thread led back to her missing godfather, and the truth buried in the abyss. Jaewon accepted. He'd learned, over the last few months, that every ally worth having showed up first as someone who'd tried to hurt him, and he'd stopped being surprised by that pattern a while ago. Word arrived within the week that gave all of them a harder target than old mysteries and half-understood mythology. The 10-sect expedition squad, freshly awakened or nearly there, had located something worth moving on immediately: the Palace of Resurrection, deep in territory controlled by a monarch named Sam Garam, a place where something called resurrection fruits sat guarded behind layers of political maneuvering and outright violence, artifacts capable of raising the dead at a cost that had corrupted an entire ruling class chasing them. Kamen, when he heard the details, said flatly that a place offering literal resurrection sounded like exactly the kind of thing worth burning to the ground before more people started worshipping it. Jaewon agreed. He'd seen enough of what desperate hope did to people, back on Earth, back on the tower's 99th floor, to know exactly how a promise like eternal life curdled into something monstrous in the wrong hands. The expedition squad assembled within days, 10 sect leaders freshly humbled and freshly strengthened. Kamen, newly awakened and eager to prove it wasn't a fluke. The Doctor of Despair, grim but steady, watching Jaewon with the particular vigilance of a man who'd already lost people to this exact kind of climb once before. Mino, sharper and lighter than the cynical rogue he'd first met, insisting on a place in the front lines rather than the sidelines. And Serwin, uncertain ally and possible key to a mystery neither of them fully understood yet, walking beside them toward a palace built on false promises. Somewhere in Gorgon's war room, before they set out, the Doctor pulled Jaewon aside one final time. He told him, quietly, that Genesis wasn't the finish line, not even close. He said a mind pushed this far eventually cracked under its own weight if it kept getting pushed without rest, and Sam Garam's forces, whatever else they were, wouldn't hesitate to push exactly that hard. Jaewon told him he understood the risk. The Doctor's expression suggested he doubted that, not out of insult, but because understanding a warning and surviving its actual cost were, as he'd said once before, two very different things. They marched anyway. Ahead of them, past gray hills and old ruins, past checkpoints that would soon learn the name of the man who'd broken Gorgon's chains, the Palace of Resurrection waited, guarded by a monarch who had no idea what kind of storm was walking toward his front gate. The Palace of Resurrection didn't look like a place built on false promises. It looked like paradise, gardens spilling down terraced hillsides in colors that shouldn't have existed in a realm as gray as the rest of chaos, fountains running with something that glittered faintly silver in the light. That was the first lie the place told, and it told it beautifully. Sam Garam ruled this stretch of territory as a monarch of the 9th region, one of 12 supreme rulers who governed the great lands above ordinary chaos. And he'd built his entire fortune on the promise those gardens implied. Somewhere beyond the terraces sat groves bearing resurrection fruits, artifacts capable of restoring a dead soul to full strength. And for centuries, Garam had rationed access to those groves like a merchant rationing water in a desert, extracting loyalty and fortune and blood from anyone desperate enough to want a second chance at life. The expedition squad approached through a side ravine Serwin knew from old maps, avoiding Garam's main patrol routes for as long as the terrain allowed. It didn't allow for long. A horn sounded somewhere in the hills before they'd covered half the distance to the palace walls, and within minutes the gardens that had looked so peaceful from a distance filled with soldiers in gold-trimmed armor, moving with the disciplined precision of troops who'd trained specifically to defend this exact ground. Kamen, at the front of the formation, muttered that peaceful scenery always hid the ugliest defenses. The first wave of Garam's forces hit hard, and for a moment the fight looked close to even. 10 freshly awakened sect leaders against soldiers who clearly outnumbered them and knew the terrain far better. Jaewon let the others hold the line while he pushed forward alone, cutting toward the palace's inner gate with a single-mindedness that left a trail of fallen soldiers behind him and confusion rippling ahead. Mino kept pace at his side, despite every instinct telling her that following him into the thick of an entire garrison was reckless. She told him, between exchanges, that reckless had apparently become her new normal since meeting him, and she wasn't sure whether to thank him or resent him for it. He told her she could decide later, once they were both still breathing to have the argument. They breached the inner gate faster than Garam's forces expected, and inside the walls the palace's true purpose revealed itself. Rows of trees, dozens of them, heavy with fruit that pulsed faintly with silver-white light, guarded by an inner circle of elite soldiers whose armor bore markings distinct even from the gold-trimmed troops outside. This was the actual treasury, the actual source of Garam's power, and every soul in chaos who'd ever begged for a second chance had, at some point, funneled wealth or loyalty or blood toward keeping this grove protected. Cayman stared at the trees for a long moment, something unreadable crossing his face. He asked, quietly, whether anyone else found it strange that a promise this beautiful had cost this many lives to maintain. Jaewon told him, beautiful promises were usually the most expensive kind. The elite guards moved to defend the grove the moment the group breached the gate, and this fight cost more than the first one had. One of the sect leaders, freshly awakened weeks earlier, took a wound deep enough that the doctor had to break off from the main fight entirely to keep her stabilized, muttering under his breath about the cost he'd warned everyone about finally starting to show itself. Jaewon and Mino cleared a path through the guards toward the grove's center, and it was there that Cayman made a choice none of them had discussed beforehand. He stood in front of the largest tree, heavy with fruit that practically hummed with promise, and he told the group, voice steady despite the chaos still unfolding around them, that a system built on selling second chances to the desperate would never actually run out of desperate people to exploit. As long as the fruit existed, someone like Garam would always find a way to control who deserved to live again and who didn't. He said the only way to actually end the cycle was to make sure nobody could hoard that choice anymore. Then he drove his fist into the trunk of the largest tree, and kept driving it, again and harder each time, ignoring the guards still fighting around him, ignoring the shout Mino let out when she realized what he intended. The tree's bark split, then cracked, then shattered entirely, fruit spilling to the ground, and bursting one by one into silver light that dissolved into the air rather than into anything usable. Garham's remaining guards froze at the sight, several of them dropping their weapons entirely, horror written across faces that had spent their whole careers protecting exactly this grove. Cayman moved to the next tree without pause, and the next, working through the grove with the same stubborn, unglamorous determination that had carried him through decades of being told he lacked talent. By the time he reached the last tree, blood ran freely from both his hands, but every resurrection fruit in the palace lay shattered and spent across the churned earth. He turned to the rest of the group afterward, breathing hard, and told them simply that greed needed something to hoard, and now there was nothing left to hoard. Whatever came of that decision, he said he'd rather live with the consequences than watch another century of people bleeding themselves dry for a promise that only ever benefited the people selling it. Mino stared at him with something between disbelief and dawning respect. She asked if he understood what he'd just done to Garam's entire power base. Cayman said he understood well enough. That was rather the point. The monarch himself arrived before anyone could process the full weight of what had just happened, descending into the grove with an entourage of lieutenants and a presence that pressed down on the air like an actual physical weight. Sam Garam didn't look angry at first glance. Not exactly. He looked like a merchant who'd just watched his entire inventory burn, calculating losses rather than feeling rage. That calm didn't last past his first proper look at the shattered trees. He asked, voice gone dangerously quiet, which of them had decided they had the right to destroy centuries of careful cultivation. Cayman stepped forward without hesitation and told him plainly that he had, and that he'd do it again given the chance. Garam's composure snapped entirely at that answer. He said coldly that immortals didn't need to fear mortal justice, that his soul link to his true body in the great lands above meant no weapon in this grove could actually kill him, only inconvenience him briefly before he simply returned stronger and considerably less merciful. Jaewon told him that sounded like exactly the kind of arrogance worth testing directly. Garam's lieutenants moved first, a dozen of them fanning out with the confident precision of soldiers who'd never once faced a threat their monarch couldn't eventually undo. Jaewon met them without slowing his stride, his thrust carving through their formation the way it had carved through everything since the 99th floor. But Garam himself hung back, unbothered, watching the slaughter of his own men with an expression closer to mild irritation than actual concern. He explained, almost conversationally, that he could afford to lose every soldier in this grove and simply purchase loyalty elsewhere, since death in chaos meant considerably less to a monarch backed by proper resources than it meant to lesser souls scraping by on borrowed time. Jaewon asked if that confidence extended to himself personally. Garam's smile in response was thin and certain, the smile of a man who genuinely believed nothing standing in front of him could touch what he actually was. He was wrong, though it took him several minutes of increasingly desperate effort to discover exactly how wrong. Garham's true strength, once he finally engaged directly, proved considerably more dangerous than his lieutenant's, his form swelling mid-fight into something closer to a demigod, wings of dark energy unfurling from his back as he abandoned pretense and unleashed power he'd clearly kept sealed for centuries out of simple, comfortable arrogance. The fight that followed cost Jaewon more than any single encounter since Beast Lane's chamber. Garham's demigod form struck with enough force to crack the ground beneath them into fissures, and for the first time since awakening, Jaewon felt something in his own mind strain under the pressure of matching that scale of power. The doctor's warning about cracking under the weight finally becoming something he could feel directly rather than just understand intellectually. Mino called out that she could see something wrong in his stance, that he was starting to slow in ways that hadn't been there minutes earlier. Jaewon didn't have breath to answer her. He was too busy holding the line against a demigod who'd started laughing, genuinely delighted, at the idea that a mortal thrust might actually be wearing him down. It was there, at the edge of his own limit, blood running from his nose and his vision beginning to blur at the corners, that Jaewon finally reached past Genesis's foundation and let it fully manifest for the first time. The mental world he'd built inside himself since surviving Serwin's 8 gates didn't stay contained any longer. It spilled outward, taking shape around him as something enormous and impossible. A presence built from every thrust he'd ever practiced and every loss he'd ever carried, manifesting physically as a colossal blade wreathed in something that looked, from a distance, disturbingly like a vast, unblinking eye. Garham's laughter cut off mid-breath. The demigod form he'd been so confident in barely had time to raise a defense before Jaewon's genesis swept forward, not as a strike so much as an inevitability, the scale of it rendering Garham's wings and armor and centuries of accumulated power almost irrelevant. The impact didn't just wound him. It unmade the demigod shape entirely, splitting it apart from the inside, Garham's true form exposed and screaming beneath the wreckage of everything he'd built his identity around. Jaewon stood over him afterward, breathing hard, the Genesis manifestation slowly folding back into himself, now that its purpose was served. Garham, broken and gasping on the churned earth, tried one final gambit, he reminded him, voice cracking with something between fear and desperate arrogance, that his soul remained linked to his true body far above, that killing this projection meant nothing, that he'd simply reform and return with an army worth actual fear. Jaewon told him that was precisely the problem he intended to solve. He drove his blade not into Garham's chest this time, but into the thin, glowing thread of light, tethering the monarch's projection to whatever true body waited safely above in the Great Lands. The thread severed with a sound like a plucked string, and Garham's scream changed pitch entirely. No longer performative arrogance, but genuine terror. The realization dawning that whatever safety net he'd relied on for centuries had just been cut away completely. Without that link, he was simply mortal, here, now, in front of them. The remaining monarchs and lieutenants who'd arrived too late to help, watching from the grove's edges, understood the implications immediately. Every soul-link tether keeping them safely immortal suddenly looked considerably more vulnerable than they'd ever imagined it could be. Several of them dropped to their knees on the spot, offering surrender, offering anything, the confident cruelty they'd worn like armor for centuries evaporating the moment true mortality became a real possibility rather than an abstract myth. Jaewon didn't offer them the mercy their fear was begging for. He told them plainly that Chaos had spent long enough letting immortal cowards decide who deserved to suffer and who didn't, and that debt was finally coming due. Garham didn't survive the hour, neither did the handful of lieutenants who'd been most enthusiastic about the Grove's old business model. By the time the fighting fully settled, the Palace of Resurrection stood empty of both its fruit and its former ruler, its gardens churned into mud and ash, its promise of second chances gone along with the man who'd hoarded it. Word of what happened there would spread through the Great Lands faster than any of them could control, and Jaewon understood, standing in the wreckage, that there was no walking this back now even if he'd wanted to. The doctor found him afterward, checking him over with the particular thoroughness of a man who'd half expected to be treating a corpse instead of a survivor. He confirmed what Jaewon already suspected, that the Genesis manifestation had cost him more than he could afford to spend often, cracks forming somewhere deep in whatever held his mind together that wouldn't heal overnight. Jaewon told him he'd rest when there was time to rest, The doctor's expression suggested he doubted that promise as much as he doubted the earlier one, but he didn't argue further. It was Serwin who brought the news that finally pushed everything toward its conclusion. She'd been quietly investigating threads related to her missing godfather throughout the campaign, and what she'd found pointed toward something bigger than Gorgon, bigger than the palace, bigger than any single monarch's ambition. The truth Molark Armelt had vanished chasing, the truth buried beneath everything Beastlane and Garum and a dozen lesser tyrants had built their power on, sat waiting in the abyss itself, the realm above the great lands where the actual gods lived, and where a tree of illusion supposedly held answers nobody in chaos had dared seek directly. She told him, quietly, that reaching it meant leaving chaos behind entirely, and that nobody who'd tried in recorded memory had come back to describe what waited there. Jaewon had spent this entire campaign one careful step removed from a decision he now realized had been coming since the moment he stepped through a broken ceiling into this world. He still had a body back on Earth, tethered by the same kind of thread he'd just severed on Garum, a physical shell lying somewhere in a hospital or a morgue, kept alive or preserved by mechanisms he didn't fully understand, anchoring him to a life he'd already left behind in every way that mattered. He gathered what remained of his allies in the ruined grove before making his choice public. Cayman, hands still bandaged from destroying the fruit. Mino, watching him with an expression she was clearly trying to keep unreadable and failing. The doctor, grim and resigned in the way of a man who'd seen this exact kind of ending before, 900 years ago, and hadn't forgotten how it went. Serwin, uncertain but resolute, carrying a mystery that had once been her missing godfathers alone, and was now theirs together. Jaewon told them plainly that whatever waited in the abyss, he intended to go find it, and he wasn't willing to keep one foot anchored safely on Earth while doing it. A tether that could be cut on someone else could just as easily be cut from the other end, and he'd rather commit fully to the fight ahead than fight it half-tethered to a life he could no longer honestly claim as his own. Nobody in the grove tried to talk him out of it. They'd all watched him make harder choices than this one already. He severed the link himself, standing in the ruined grove with the same blade that had ended Beastlane and Garum both, cutting the thread connecting him to whatever remained of his body back on a planet he hadn't seen in true form since a torn bag of chips and an ordinary morning. Somewhere far away, in a hospital bed or a quiet room nobody would ever fully explain, a heart that had been quietly beating on borrowed time finally, gently, stopped. He felt something ease in his chest the moment it was done. Some tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying since the day the towers first rose. Mino was the one who spoke first into the silence that followed. She told him, voice steadier than he expected, that if he intended to march into a realm nobody came back from, he wasn't doing it without her following eventually. She said she'd spent too long being someone who watched people leave and didn't have the nerve to follow, and she wasn't interested in being that person any longer. He told her the abyss wasn't someplace safe to follow him into. She told him nothing about the last few months had been safe, and she hadn't turned back yet. Cayman and the doctor stayed behind, along with Serwin, tasked with holding together the fragile unity Jaewon had forced onto Chaos's 10 sects and the shattered remains of Garum's territory, work that would take longer than any single campaign and mattered just as much as whatever waited above. Serwin promised to keep chasing whatever threads led toward Molark's fate, certain now that the truth was closer than she'd let herself believe for centuries. Jaewon walked toward the edge of chaos alone, the boundary between this realm and whatever came next visible now as a faint shimmer in the gray sky, the same kind of tear he'd once punched through a tower's ceiling, waiting to be opened again, this time from the other side. Behind him, in a nightmare tower somewhere in Gorgon's territory, Mino Han stepped through a gate of her own, beginning a climb that mirrored the one he'd made 40 years earlier, driven by the same stubborn refusal to accept an easy exit that had first made him worth following at all. Ahead of him, past the shimmer in the sky, the abyss waited, along with gods who had no idea a man with nothing but a single perfected thrust and a debt to every friend he'd buried was already on his way to make them answer for it.